Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and our podcast is known as Life Along the Merrimack. We discuss the health and the history of the Merrimack River. Sometimes we have guests who discuss the various elements of the river, but today I'm going to be reporting on a news summary of an important meeting that took place last week in Haverhill. It was the kickoff meeting of the Merrimack River District Commission, held at Northern Essex Community College. There were about 60 public officials there, including state, local, and federal, plus there were scientists and environmentalists. They were brought together by the concern that the river is sometimes getting dirtier, not cleaner. Overflows from sewage treatment plants, called combined sewer overflows, are fouling the river after heavy rain. A lot of people know this. Some of us in Newburyport, as a matter of fact, see a brown river from time to time. And Mayor Donna Holliday of Newburyport has been a leader in bringing this to attention. And because climate change seems to be bringing more rain to the North Shore and in greater bursts, it seems like we're going to have these CSOs for quite a while. And so that's why so many people came together. It's taken almost 6 months to get all these individuals together, but there's a great effort going on. The sponsors, in terms of individuals, were State Senator Diana DeZoglio of the 1st Essex District, that means Newburyport to Methuen, State Rep Jim Kalkors from Amesbury, Mayor Donna Holliday of Newburyport, and the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. This was their summit. It's the first proposed summit of more to happen, and they will start again in September. And for those out there who think that nothing can be done about the river, this was a very constructive meeting. And there were some takeaways from the meeting. It was fully 2 hours. I'm a former journalist, so this is what I really like to do. And I'm talking to you about it now because it's important to report back and tell people what's going on. Again, there's some sense out there that nothing's being done, but this is not true. So listen, many professionals came to this event so we could have a cleaner river. And listen to the large number of organizations: the State Department of Environmental Protection, the State Department of Public Health, the State Department of Environmental and Recreational Activity, the State Department of Conservation, UMass Lowell, Merrimack River Watershed Council, Groundwork Lawrence, the Lowell Parks and Conservation Trust, Save the Harbor, Save the Bay. I've never heard of that one, but I'm sure it's worthwhile. Environmental League of Massachusetts, the Conservation Law Foundation, the Massachusetts River Alliance, the operators of many treatment facilities, including those from Lawrence, Lowell, and Haverhill. And for our part of the river, those are the biggest dischargers. There were Conservation Commission members from numerous communities, and there were representatives from Senator Markey's office and other individuals at the state level. So there were a lot of elected officials from the North Shore, and this was really the first meeting of the new commission. And it seems like momentum is building so improvements can be made. Now, if that starts with commissions and committees and bureaucratic talk, so be it. That's how Maine Senator Ed Muskie started in the mid-'70s. He was one of the few people at that time calling for clean rivers because several in Maine were among the dirtiest in the country, and the Merrimack River here in Massachusetts was among the dirtiest in the country. So he was one, way out ahead, and when he was starting out, there was a lot of opposition. Right now, there hasn't been too much organized opposition that I can see in terms of corporations. In Muskie's day, there were paper mills, in Maine and New Hampshire, who were very much against the Clean Water Act because the debris that they put into the river took oxygen out of the water and really made it difficult for fish and wildlife. But this commission has started, and it seems like they're much energized to get something done. Another element that we should be aware of in the last week or two, about $500 million is being sought from the federal government to help rebuild some of these sewerage systems. And when I say the word sewerage, that means the pipes. And because, as we know, more than a century ago, most communities built their sewage treatment plants so that the sewage would come into the treatment plant, but also the pipes that picked up rainwater and stormwater would also come into the sewer treatment plant. So when you got terrific rains, as we frequently have now, you would mix rainwater with the sewage. It would become too much for the treatment plant to handle, and they would release raw sewage into the river. And that is what's happening now. Now, I know that raw sewage isn't something we like to think about, but I think that's why this is such a disturbing development. And so the river gets dirtier, which is bad for the many boats and swimmers and fisher people on the river, but also close to 600,000 people on the North Shore get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. Now, granted, it is cleansed. I don't think there's any danger. None's been reported. But it should be known that cleaner water in the river would be a good thing. So Congresswoman Lori Trahan from Lowell and Congressman Seth Moulton, who represents the North Shore, including Newburyport, are two of those individuals who are seeking $500 million to improve the sewage treatment plants in this area. And it might be noted that there is a fund for this, a federal fund, and it has to be rooted in an appropriate way. But sometimes in the community, I hear people say, well, there's no federal money, or, President Trump's administration will never permit it. But the fact is, there is a standing committee in the House that has a fund that may be replenished soon, so they are seeking $500 million. Another element that came out of this summit was the need for a pre-notification program. Now, leaders are seeking $100,000 so the city of Newburyport could start a state pilot program to create a system to inform the populace of potential swimming and boating hazards after there's been a big release upriver. And the problem now is we don't really know. If, say, in Lowell, they had a release of, say, 100,000 gallons of raw sewage, we would not know that down here. We would not know if Haverhill released. There's no system at the moment. So you can see that this would be a useful element if people would know. It could be online. It could be putting up a flag at a marina or a municipal harbor. I mean, that's pretty basic. But right now, there's no way of knowing. And since we have so many people on the river in the summer, in fact, more than 1,500 pleasure boats are registered on the Newburyport side of the river in itself. So there's, hundreds of people, thousands of people who are enjoying the river. And they should know when things are happening. Right now, there is no way to know there is a way to know, but it's not being used. And I must say, at this meeting, which was about 2 hours, the operators of the treatment plants in Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill actually sat at a table and answered questions. And they got a little defensive, I must say. And in fact, one of them said, new programs to notify people are okay, but they should not be adversarial, which I took to mean we don't want to get blamed for this. We only have so much money. We're doing the best we can. We'll work with you, in any way. But it's one of those things where we just can't do any more than we're doing right now. So that sounded legitimate. And, no one was actually complaining about their work. In fact, they were, good to come to the meeting in the first place. And the other thing they said is, we're not public health officers. We're not trained to meet with the public, or we're not trained to inform the public when we have discharges, or to explain, how much of a discharge would be damaging, how much would not. And so the way I see things, at least that is one short-term activity that could take place. If a public health officer is somehow linked into the largest sewage treatment plants on the Merrimack River, they could, quote, add up the number of discharges. If you have Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill discharging after a big storm, they could get the information from each of the plants and make that known. That is pretty easy, and I think that can be done. And in terms of discharges per year, those are the big ones. Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill are the ones in Massachusetts. And that sidesteps the fact that some of the larger discharges of sewage are in Manchester, New Hampshire, and Nashua, New Hampshire. So I'll just read from a document. The maximum number of discharge events per year, Manchester has 49 discharges per year. Nashua has 25 discharges. Lowell had 37 last year. The Greater Lawrence District had 14, and Haverhill had 41. So that's a large number of discharges where effluent is going straight into the river. So I believe that's what everyone is looking at. Again, they're trying not to blame other people, but this has to be, part of why people are concerned is that, more than 100 times a year, these large sewage treatment plants are just letting go from 100,000 maybe to 500,000 gallons of raw sewage. And, of course, we should know. One of the interesting remarks, or actually observations, that was part of a different program I went to, was made by Henry David Thoreau in 1849. Now, he was a great naturalist. He lived in Concord. He wrote books. His first book was A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. That was published in 1849. And at that time, 1849, he remarked, "Salmon, shad, and aloes were formerly abundant here until the dam, and until the factories came to Lowell, put an end to their migrations. Perchance, after a few thousand years, if the fishes will be patient and pass their summers elsewhere, nature will have leveled the situation. The Lowell factories and the Grassland River will run clear again, and I look forward to that day." So this is rather whimsical by Henry David Thoreau, but I think you get the idea. As back as far as 1849, people who loved the river and used it frequently were finding that the fish were less prevalent. Sewage was going directly into the rivers. At that time, many of the areas did not have sewage treatment plants. And so that was something that I think that links us with the past, that this has been a problem for a long time. In a separate development on Friday, state officials released new standards on cleanliness and safety that plants must follow. So that is a good thing. They had been planning to do it, and now they are going to be talking with people at the different treatment plants and saying, you have to be more forthright in saying how much you discharge. You have to tell somebody when you're discharging that. And so this, in a way, is a great thing. It doesn't mean it's going to happen immediately, but it does mean that the Federal Environmental Protection Agency is interfacing with these sewage treatment operators and saying, you've got to do better. We're concerned about these discharges. We're going to be watching you. Because you have to have a federal discharge permit in order to run these facilities. Now, those permits have lapsed in most communities on the North Shore, including the ones we've talked about, Lowell and Lawrence and Haverhill. The federal government is being semi-patient about this, but they're saying, you guys have to do a better job, and from now on, we're going to be watching more closely. So that strikes me as another element of why things are getting a little better. Mayor Donna Holliday in Newburyport has been a real leader in this. I remember when I was covering, I covered the waterfront for the Daily News here in Newburyport for 5 or 6 years, and she was very concerned that Newburyport's at the end of the line. We get a lot of the effluent from upriver, and it's hard to, deal directly with other cities and say you have to do a better job. And it's harder to deal with those communities in in New Hampshire, such as Manchester, who are very large dischargers, but they don't have so much of a stake in Massachusetts waters. But she has been doing a good job with that. More will be done in the future, and there will be another meeting in September. One element that people were talking about in this past week, and this is a different topic, was the ship that was down on the river in Newburyport. It was the Santa Maria, was docked here actually for about 10 days, and people could go on the vessel, look over it. Certainly you can see the beautiful river from there. It was brought in by the Custom House Maritime Museum and was here for about 10 days. And, just if you're tuning in now, this is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. And so I'm bringing the Santa Maria up because, it was on the river. It's part of our culture. And I went on it several times. It's remarkable. It was the same size as one of the vessels that Christopher Columbus came over here on. That's why it's known as the Santa Maria. It was very small. I think they had maybe a contingent of 14 to 16 crew members. And to be 3 months in a vessel like that, it was a difficult situation. But they had breakfast on the vessel. They had, I think, fundraisers came there for a cocktail party. And I think we all learned a little more about Columbus, about going across the seas. Now, this is owned by a nonprofit corporation in Spain. They had come from Norfolk, Virginia. They stayed here about 10 days. And from here, they're going to Rochester, New York. And so they'll go up north towards Canada, and then they'll go down the St. Lawrence River. And it was curious talking to these people. They went to an event at the Maritime Museum Friday evening called First Friday Social Event. This is for members, but if you want to be a member, of course, you can join. And they talked about some of their challenges. It is a motorized vessel, but they have to be very aware of the sea and very, aware of the weather. It reminds me of an event several years ago here in Newburyport, actually about 7, when the Bounty came to Newburyport. This was a facsimile of a vessel used in the movie Mutiny on the Bounty. That was in 1960. It had Marlon Brando in it, you might remember. But the Bounty was going from Booth Bay Harbor, Maine, to Florida to meet a commercial engagement, meaning someone was going to use it for a TV commercial or a commercial fundraising. And it had stopped in Portland, Newburyport, Gloucester, and then it went down to Connecticut before it left for Florida. And many people in the Newburyport area saw the vessel, and actually some people went on it. It was 3 masts and a crew of 16, and it stayed here for several days. Now, you might recall there was a very sad ending to this situation. After it left New London, Connecticut, for Florida, it ran into Hurricane Sandy, and the vessel was lost. It had a crew of 16. 14 of the 16 were saved by Coast Guard rescue teams, but 2 were lost, including the captain and a part-time crew member. named Candace Cameron, and her body was found, but she was never, she could not be resuscitated. The captain's body was never found. So I always think about that when I see vessels such as the Santa Maria, that they've got to be careful out there. They have, in the case of the Bounty, it had good technology. It knew the hurricane was coming, but it misjudged its size, it misjudged its force, and it's kind of one of the greatest errors in modern, yachting history, the fact that they sailed into a hurricane and they kept trying to sail south and east of the hurricane rather than go into port. The captain, said later, his words were later conveyed. He said, well, if we go into a port, the vessel will be jostled. We'll run up against the other vessels if they're also there. So we're going to go out and get around the hurricane. But what a bad mistake that was. Now, the captain, a Vermont native, was never found. And some people felt, well, maybe he went down with the vessel. In the old days, and in some military traditions, the captain goes down with a ship. You folks may have heard that. But during the inquiry following the sinking of the Bounty, several people said, he wouldn't have gone down with the ship. He had a wife, he had 2 daughters, at home. He had a lot to live for. He probably was the last person off of the vessel. And so he probably wanted to go down below and make sure everybody was okay. So this is one situation I guess we'll never know. But Newburyport was that close to a tall ship. It did stay here a couple days. In 2012, we're talking. It left here and, of course, sank off of North Carolina. The Coast Guard had one of its greatest rescues ever. It had a chopper go out there. It was 70 miles off of North Carolina. The winds were at 50 knots. The seas were high. And they would drop a swimmer into the ocean, and the swimmer would go over to a lifeboat. There were 2 lifeboats, and they were enclosed lifeboats. That's evidently a big deal, because when El Faro, another vessel, went down 2015, went down off the Bahamas, its lifeboats were not enclosed, and it gave the survivors little chance. In that sinking, 33 people died, and of course, at the for the Bounty, 14 people lived and 2 died. But one by one, they did find the 2 lifeboats, and one by one, a swimmer would be dropped from an aircraft helicopter, and he'd swim around, get one person, put him in a hook, in a basket, and that survivor would be winched up into the helicopters. So you had a very difficult situation. The wind is blowing, the seas are high, the swimmer only can help one person at a time. But through this and through several different trips out to the survivors, they are able to save 14 of 16. Actually, I've written a book about this. This is called New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Mariners. It'll be out this winter. But I digress. I do mention that because it was such a riveting element, and because the Bounty had been here in Newburyport, just as the Santa Maria had. And I want to read a little article I wrote for the Maritime Museum website, because I am the outreach historian there. And it's a short story about shipbuilding and vessels in Newburyport. So here it is. The presence of the Santa Maria along the waterfront from May 31st to June 10th reminds us that a great number of sailing ships once called Newburyport home. The community had scores of boatyards and was the nation's leading shipbuilding center in the late 19th and early 20th, no, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, according to the great historian Samuel Eliot Morison. And if you're a history major or took any American history, you'll know he was the most eminent. And Mrs. Vale, E. Vale Smith, E stands for Euphemia, should you wonder. Mrs. Euphemia Vale Smith wrote in her comprehensive history of Newburyport, which was published in 1854, that in 1934 there were 28 ships, 26 brigs, 145 schooners, 4 barks, and 4 sloops in the district of Newburyport. Now, isn't that remarkable? Over 200 ships called home here. And I would say here, in this case, a ship is a classification of a large ocean-going boat. Now it's kind of generic, but a ship would have been a 3-master, one of the largest ships you'd see anywhere. But we had, at that time in 1854, we had more than 200 vessels just in Newburyport. And historian John Currier, who was from Newburyport also, wrote a history of Newburyport in 1906. And he said that vessels built here enable local merchants to develop unique trade opportunities. And Currier wrote, from 1784 to 1794, the number of vessels arriving in Newburyport from Guadeloupe, Port-au-Prince, St. Martin's, Suriname, and Martinique had cargoes of molasses, sugar, coffee, and cotton. And ships coming from Madeira, Spain, came with wine, from Turk's Island with salt, from Ireland with linen, from Rotterdam with gunpowder, from Dunkirk with earthenware and carpeting, from Bilboa with silk handkerchiefs, silk gloves, and glassware. They were all looked upon by custom house officials and paid duties. Now, isn't that remarkable? More than 2 centuries ago, you had all this tremendous trade going on right at Newburyport. We had a custom house, which is still there. It was built in 1835. You folks might know it. It's right on Water Street. But it just does show that this is such a remarkable area for shipbuilding and commerce. Now, the age of sail could be beautiful as well as profitable. Currier wrote that on May 1st, 1820, a fleet of more than 40 vessels, which had been detained for a week by easterly winds, sailed from Newburyport at about noon. According to the Newburyport Herald, the local newspaper, they said, "We believe our river never was whitened with so much canvas at one time as was spread yesterday at noon. It was a delightful sight." So that's kind of an example of many ships in the harbor. This was before engines, and when they sailed out, it must have been a very beautiful thing. I might mention that we were a leading shipbuilder until, say, the mid-19th century. We could not build larger ships. If we built a very large wooden vessel with 200 or 300 tons, it could go out of the harbor, but it could not come back laden with cargo. It's very shallow at the opening of the river. It's shallow now as it was 200 years ago. And then when the age of steam came and vessels were iron and steel, and were even heavier than the large wooden ships, that just meant we were not in the game anymore. And even today, there are boaters who come to Newburyport and sometimes have a difficult time. You know, it'll be shallow, or the sandbar may have moved over the winter. And so it's always a difficult thing for newcomers, and people have become aware that if you come to Newburyport, you've got to be careful. You've got to watch the flags. You've got to see what the local harbor master has said, which stay to the north, stay near the north jetty. The bar is on the south now, so stay to the north. There's a lot that has to go on. So I think one thing that we do here on our program, Life Along the Merrimack, we talk about the history of the river, and we talk about the health of the river. And we talk about the health of the river primarily because we want it to remain clean and good for entertainment, for boating, for swimming, for drinking. In Newburyport, we don't get our drinking water from the Merrimack, but as we said, in Lawrence they do. So that is what we do here. And I thank you for listening. I thank you for watching. We are trying to monitor the activities as public officials try to do better and make a cleaner river. And we'll be talking about that in the future. So I will be back next week. We will talk more about the history of the river in this program, which is Life Along the Merrimack. Thank you very much. I'm Dyke Hendrickson.